So, Bergson's study on Lucretius belongs to the period when he was teaching philosophy at the Lycée Blaise Pascal in Clermont-Ferrand. It is a very simple introduction to the language and thought of Lucretius, written for high school students, but at the same time has some interesting ideas. In it, Bergson emphasizes the originality of the philosophy of Lucretius compared to Epicurus. He writes, interpreting Epicurus carefully, believing he was translating his work, Lucretius was, perhaps unwittingly, extraordinarily original. To see this, one should compare one by one the text of Epicurus that were added to the verses of Lucretius, who translated them, elaborating on them. It would be evident that the poet, through apparently insignificant additions, especially through the tone that he gives to the phrase, renews the thought of his teacher, or rather provokes a whole new feeling in our souls. According to Bergson, Epicurus seems to have not loved nature in the sense that he rejects science merely as knowledge of natural phenomena, but consider it a weapon against superstition. He writes, if the system of Democritus fascinates him, it is because it has the ability to attribute everything to mechanical and natural causes. What are these causes in each particular case? It does not matter. Instead, an entirely different approach by Lucretius. What struck Lucretius about Democritus' doctrine, seen through the filter of the philosophy of Epicurus, is exactly what Epicurus gave little importance to: the imperturbable fixity of the laws of nature. If today, if from time immemorial nothing else exists other than atoms and combinations of atoms and displacements of atoms, if these atoms move in eternal and ineluctable motion, then it is inevitable that fixed and immutable laws preceded birth and development and decay of things. In light of what Lucretius believes to be the essential idea of Epicureanism, beneath the infinitely varied phenomena of apparently capricious nature, he sees atoms that move in very specific directions, immutable laws that work uniformly. The originality of Lucretius' position would then consist in having returned to the philosophy of Epicurus a great and poetic idea, already developed by Democritus, mildly supported by Epicurus, and in any case new in Rome: the eternal fixity of the laws of nature. According to Bergson, this idea led Lucretius to perceive and predict what modern science could only formalize with a clear demonstration, including extensive reference to atomic theory that, after 20 centuries of trial and error, chemistry could only return, and almost en passant, to Darwinian theory. It would be easy to show, he writes, as on other points, for example, on the question of the origin of living beings, Lucretius anticipates the great theories of our time. More than once, the analogy between the ideas presented in the fifth book and those of the great naturalist Darwin have been observed. We can only report this similarity and not insist on it, as today the theory of evolution is still only a hypothesis. End of quote. In the proceeding of a conference dedicated to the thought of Maupertuis, that Filippo has drawn my attention on it, Canguilhem refers precisely to this Bergsonian interpretation, criticized as a paradigmatic error. Bergson would fall into the error of considering Lucretius as a precursor, a forerunner of Darwin, without understanding the Lucretian problematic. In other words, there would be a simple resemblance, but the problematic would be completely different. In fact, the occasion for this remark is given by a reflection on Maupertuis, precursors or forerunner of transformism. Canguilhem writes, "It is simple taking two isolated passages to find something like an anticipation, but this under the condition of misunderstanding the context. Writing the history of science in this way, you can find precursors to everyone. One can imagine also Lucretius-like precursor. But in Lucretius, there is, first of all, a proliferation of forms. And after, by virtue of pact of nature, things reproduce themselves following a norm. So it is the contrary of transformism. The interpretation of Bergson is wrong." Leaving aside the question of Lucretius as a precursor of Darwinism, in which we can certainly agree with Canguilhem on the main criticism, and in any case it would bring into play other factors, such as the different image of Darwin by the two authors. The opposition between Bergson and Canguilhem actually proves to be paradigmatic with respect to a strategic place for the theory of Lucretius, the federa natura, the pacts of nature, and the relationship of them with the monsters. On one hand, Bergson founded the anticipation of Darwinism in the anteriority of laws of nature in respect to monsters. On the other hand, for Canguilhem, just the posteriority of the pact of nature in respect to the monster would make the rapprochement inconsistent. Let's re-examine the text of Lucretius in order to try to shed some light on the issue. In several passages of his poem, Lucretius asserts the existence of natural laws, of federa natura, which explain what can be instead of what cannot, and why everything has limited power and an expiration date fixed inside. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. This proposition is posed by Lucretius at the basis of his conception of nature. In the first book, after the famous eulogy of Epicurus and the apology of his doctrine, Lucretius sets out the principium which will allow to dry out how, through fear, all mortal men are held in check. They view many things done on earth and in the sky, effects whose causes they cannot see at all, and so they assume that such things happen because of God. Nothing, writes Lucretius, can be produced from nothing for a divine intervention. If in fact something could come from nothing, the universe would be divided of any order. He writes, "For if they came out of nothing, all kinds of things could be produced from all things. Nothing would want a seed. Firstly, men could arise from the sea, from the earth, scaly tribes and birds. Cattle and beasts as well might burst forth from the sky. In fact, where there should be no bodies apt to generate each kind, how could there be a constant, unchanging matter for things? But as it is, because every kind is produced from fixed seed, the source of everything that is born and comes forth into the border of light is that wherein is the material of it and its first bodies, the corpora prima. Besides, why do we see the rose put forth in spring, corn in the heat, grapes under the persuasion of autumn, unless because each created thing discloses itself when at their own time the seeds of things have gathered together? While the due seasons are present and their lively earth safely brings out things young and tender into the borders of light. But if they came from nothing, suddenly they would arise at uncertain intervals and at unshootable times of the year. End of quote. Everything in nature happens according to a rhythm and in a specific context, according to a regularity based on the existence of corpora simplicissima, particles, simple particles, infinite in number and not based on difference, that eterno tempore remain immutable. Lucretius writes, again, since it is now agreed that a limit has been fixed for the growth of things after their kind and for their tenure of life, and since it stands decreed what each can do by ordinance of nature, pacts of nature, and also what each cannot do, and since nothing change, may all things are constant to such a degree that all the many-colored birds show in succession marks upon their bodies to distinguish their kind. The fixed cycle of the seasons, the persistence of the same forms of living species over successive generations seems to be the preferred example of federa natura. As Lucretius wrote in his second book, after the famous passages on clinamen, wherefore in whatsoever motion the bodies of first beginnings are now, in that same motion they were in ages gone by, and hereafter they will always be carried along in the same way, and the things which have been wont to be born will be born under the same conditions. They will be and will grow and will be strong with their strength as much as is granted to each by the laws of nature, the federa natura. The immutability of elementary particles find its possibility of knowledge and at the same time the norm of what can be and of what is impossible. In fact, the structure of elementary particles renders some forms of aggregation possible and other impossible. He writes, however, it must not be thought that all can be conjoined in all ways, for then you would commonly see monstrosity come into being, shapes of men arising that would be half beasts, lofty branches at times sprouting from a living body, parts of a terrestrial creature often conjoined with creatures of the sea. Chimeras, again, breathing flame from the noisome throats, pastured by nature over lands that would produce everything. But then, none of these things happen, is manifest, since we see that all things bred from fixed seeds, by a fixed mother, are able to conserve their kind as they grow. Of a surety, this must come about in a fixed way, a certa ratio. In these verses, the repetition of the adjective certus determinate that Jean Salem tells us is used about 100 times throughout the poem indicates that it is the determinate being of the seed which excludes the possibility of the existence of the monsters of mythology. The determinate being of the seeds, being determined in a given way, establishes the being determinate of the ratio, which regulates the becoming. Ratio that is not transcendent in relation to the bodies, but consists of their same shape and of the possibility of aggregation. Therefore, the possible existence of something and the impossibility of others. It is this determination that everything that is born receives from nature that renders impossible the existence of mythological creatures, creatures with a dual nature. Lucretius writes, centaurs never existed, nor at any time can there be creatures of double and twofold body combined together, of incompatible limbs, unless the power and force of the two alphas are fairly balanced. Here is the proof that will convince the duelist wit. Firstly, the horse is at the best of his vigor about the age of 3 years fully past. Not so the boy, by any means, for even at this time he will often in sleep seek his mother's milky breast. Afterwards, when the strong powers of the horse are failing in old age and his body faints as life recedes, then is the time that youth takes possession of that boy in the flower of his years, clothing his cheeks with soft down. End of quote. Mythological creatures cannot exist, nor have ever existed, because every being has its own temporality, its determined rhythm, that cannot be harmonized, if not in the poetic imagination, with that of another being. The affirmation of the existence of pacts of nature seems to suggest a kind of determinism in which the permanence of the forms is guaranteed. The cycle of the seasons, the reproduction of the species. The becoming is channeled on the tracks of a necessity that is presented as an eternal repetition of the same. However, it is not so. This regularity, this cyclic perpetuation is not the primum, but it is in effect a consequence of a certain type of encounters between the atoms, encounters not led by a telos, but found. Lucretius writes, "For certainly neither did the first beginnings place themselves by designing each in its own order with keen intelligence, nor assuredly did they make agreement what motions each should produce. But because being many and shifted in many ways, they are hurried and set in motion with blows throughout the universe from infinity. Thus, by trying every kind of motion and combination, at length they fall into such arrangements as this sum of things consists of, the summa rerum." At the origin of the form, there is then neither an immanent telos, a nature understood in the Aristotelian sense as a principle of motion and rest of a given being, nor a divine plan, mens sagax, through as immanent or transcendent, thought as immanent or transcendent. The current structure of the universe is instead the result of an infinite number of shocks, movements, unions, the result of endless attempts in an infinite time. We could say, as long as it is understood that the attempts are only so regarding the present structure of the universe, afterwards, with retrospect, but not in the sense that the attempts in themselves imply incompleteness or imperfection. A first consequence of this theory is the infinity of the worlds. A second consequence is the fundamental fact that the world has a birth and a death. Finally, the third result, perhaps the most important one from a theoretical point of view, is the existence of monsters. Many were the monsters also that the earth then tried to make springing up with wondrous appearance and frame, the hermaphrodite, between man and woman, yet neither, different from both, some without feet, other again bereft of hands, some found dumb, also without a mouth, some blind, without face, some bound fast with all their limbs adhering to their bodies, so that they could do nothing and go nowhere, could neither avoid mischief nor take what they might need. So with the rest of like monster and portents that she made, it was all in vain. since nature denied them growth, and they could not attain the desired flower of age, nor find that living food, nor joined by the ways of Venus. For we see, so that they may able by procreation to forge out the chain of the generation. The regularity of the forms and their cyclical perpetuation is actually founded on encounter and on a type of composition that does not exclude the other, but that is more suited to life and reproduction. The form does not persist by virtue of its teleology, but every form is the result of a conjunction that only in the presence of the concurrere, of the concursus of some circumstances, can it become a connection that lasts. It was said that Lucretius has denied the existence of mythological creatures based on the pacts of nature that regulate the becoming of forms, as they impede a living being to be composed of two completely different temporal rhythms. This denial, however, seems not to imply the affirmation of immutability and limitation of the forms, but rather the need to think and not to imagine their real multiplicity and instability. To fully understand the meaning of this Lucretian passage, it is crucial to highlight the relationship that it establishes with the previous tradition. This is taken from Empedocles on the attempt to establish the primacy of the encounter of the chance over the form, attempt against which Aristotle polemicized in a fundamental place of the Physics, especially paragraph 8 of second book, in which we find one of the philosophical most beautiful and powerful pages of Aristotle. Here Aristotle analyzes a possible fault in his theoretical construction, at whose center is the concept of form. This gap is strictly inherent in the definition of chance as an apparent teleology. Aristotle wonders if every teleology is not in reality apparent, an appearance of finality. In other words, if every form is not in reality an effect of chance. Here is, no, I don't read the passage, I resume it. Everything could have happened by necessity and not for the sake of an end. It rains, this is a fact, and rain can have positive effects to make crops grow or negative effects to spoil crops on the threshing floor. In the two cases, it does not rain for an end, but necessarily, say Aristotle. Aristotle wonders if every form could not be thought on the model of rain and its possible effects on grain. Form would be none other than the result of a successful combination of necessity, a good organization that for this reason persists. By contrast, bad organizations perish and have perished like calves with human faces. Forms, then, do not exist because they are produced with an end to existing, but because they are casually adapted to existence. This primacy of the encounter over form is an hypothesis that Aristotle discards, relying on the use of the language that structures it, which is identified with the very ontological structure of reality. As Wieland puts it perfectly, wherever we speak of chance, we have always already positively stated, first of all, teleological structures. If we follow Canguilhem in his short but clear interpretative sketch on Lucretius, we are faced with this type of reading. Before the establishment of the pact of nature, there is a kind of proliferation of forms that would be the kingdom of chance. Afterwards, the pact of nature would open the kingdom of the form, the kingdom of necessity. However, if we follow Bergson, we will be in front of the kingdom of the necessity, of eternal laws of nature, which in any case do not concern the persistence of the forms, the cyclic repetition of the seasons, the persistence of identical characteristics of the species throughout generations, but the combination of the atoms. The establishment of a particular norm, certa ratio, which gives rise to the form and its reproduction, always in the same form, is not thence guaranteed by the pacts of nature. It's not thence guaranteed by the pacts of nature anymore, then the monsters are an exception to them. The chance does not come before the necessity, but it innervates it. Of the multiple combinations of atoms needed, some give rise to forms that are not suitable for reproduction, others that are. But the pacts of nature are the basis of both combinations, and instead exclude the monsters of mythology due to the impossible combinations of atoms. And the form is still the effect of chance, in the sense of a necessity that governs the fortuitous combination that gives rise to its reproductions, which other conditions contribute to not only internally but also externally, but not directly to its reproduction. In both interpretation, the key term is therefore federa natura. First of all, a terminological notation. Fedus is commonly translated as law of nature, inevitably referring to the natural laws of modern science, whose immutability is an effect of the decree of a creator and a transcendent God. While it would be better translate with pact or alliance, therefore beyond metaphor, in conjunction, composition, returning radical horizontality to them, to the term. In other words, in Lucretius, the body do not obey laws that transcend them, but constitute them or on a completely immanent plane through conjunctions and compositions. That said, we take all the occurrence of the expression federa natura in the poem to try to shed some light on the issue. Are only 4 occurrences. In the first book, Lucretius evokes federa natura about the immutability of atoms. Lucretius says here that every form of natural regularity is based on the immutability of the primary elements of the atom. A prime example of this regularity is the inheritance of the characters and the persistence of the same form in the different generations. In the second book, the federa naturae are evoked in reference to the immutability of the density of matter and atomic motion. Here again, federa naturae are the guarantee of the regulated repetition of the birth, growth, life in natural beings. In Book 5, the pacts of nature are evoked in the context of the affirmation of birth and death of the earth and the sky. In this context, natural law, pacts of nature, do not govern the repetition of the form, but rather the destruction of it. There is nothing in heaven and earth which is not subject to birth and death. And in the same book, the federa natura established the impossibility of the existence of mythological creatures. And there is a passage that I already read. The belief in the existence of mythological creature is established on an inane nomen novitatis, in a void name of novelty, while the Federa Naturae do not establish the impossibility of a new development or change or the multiplicity, but rather the combination of different rhythms, combination which is the product of the imagination. The analysis of these passages highlights the textual ambiguity which engages the interpretative difference between Bergson and Canguilhem. Lucretius' prime example revolve around the persistence or the destruction of the form, and in any case, the Federa Naturae are never law of the persistence and demise of the form, but of the encounter, of the composition. No, sorry, it's not good translated. From one end, the Federa Naturae are guarantee of the form. From another hand, the Federa Naturae are the guarantee of the law of composition and decomposition of the atoms. If therefore we follow Canguilhem in thinking the pacts of nature as the guarantee of immutability of the form and that they exist only after the proliferation of forms unsuitable for breeding, we end up projecting on this proliferation a concept of chaos, which is the symmetrical inverse of the concept of order of the form. Following Bergson, instead, we would consider the Federa as the immanent order that presides at the encounters of the atoms, encounter that can take place in different ways and which can give rise to a multiplicity of forms, suitable or unsuitable for reproduction, setting the limits of possible and impossible according to the conformation of the prime elements. The unfit forms for reproduction are possible. The mythological monsters are impossible for reasons of rhythm of atomic structure. This second direction leads us to the concept of nature as mutation and at the same time at the boundary between the possible and the impossible, beautifully expressed in these Lucretian verses. For time changes the nature of the whole universe, and one state of thing must pass in another, and nothing remains as it was. All things move, all are changed by nature and compelled to alter. For one thing crumbles and grows faint awake with age, another grows up and comes forth from contempt. So, therefore, time changes the nature of the whole universe, and one state of the earth gives place to another, so that what she bore, she cannot, but can bear what she bore before. Now, when Althusser, in the underground current of the materialism of the encounter, talks about the clinamen, saying that this concept raises the argument that the origin of every world and therefore of all reality and of all meaning is due to a swerve, and that swerve, not reason or cause, is the origin of the world. When he says that the underground current of materialism, for which the sources Epicurus and Lucretius, he opposes idealism and a traditional materialism, isn't he rather refusing an idea of Federa Naturae as a guarantee of the repetition of the form? Althusser writes that Epicurus and Lucretian begin a profound tradition that sought its materialist anchorage in a philosophy of the encounter. Once this tradition's radical rejection of all philosophies of essence, ousia, essentia, wesen, that is, of reason, logos, ratio, Vernunft, and therefore of origin and end, the origin being nothing more here than the anticipation of the end in reason or primordial order, in the interest of a philosophy which rejecting the whole and every order, rejects the whole and order in favor of dispersion. Derrida would say, in his terminology, dissemination and disorder. If the Federa Naturae were to guarantee the fit, the Lucretian philosophy would be a philosophy of essence and of reason. This is the reading of Canguilhem. But if with Althusser the clinamen is thought as that which breaks the decree of fate, fati federa rumpat, interrupts the vertical fall of the atoms in the void and gives rise to the canon. Canon è carambola, speriamo. Perché, then, in principle, there is the swerve, not essence or reason. The clinamen breaks the pacts of fate and gives rise to the pacts of nature. It allows the encounter of the atoms. And if in principle there is the deviation, not the logos and the form in nature cannot be nothing else but an effect, the certa ratio of an encounter, of a composition whose reproduction, whose persistence is marked by the same contingency of its emergence. Grazie. Pensa che fatica leggere in inglese.
Thank you, Vittorio. We have a bit more than 20 minutes for the discussion. And any question?
It's a clarification question. I still don't understand. So, what is the criterion? How can be proven that the mythological figures cannot have existed, whereas monsters can? I still don't understand what is the criterion.
Because mythological creatures for Lucretius are composition of two living of two natures.
Yes,
and every nature has a rhythm.
Yeah.
And you cut two nature and you put together two nature. And this is
why would
the monsters are some attempts to create a living being.
Yeah.
And it's not a problem of rhythms. They have their own rhythm, but they cannot reproduce themselves. They are made in a way that they cannot reproduce themselves. I think
that's why they don't survive, because they are
yes,
not,
they cannot reproduce.
There's a case of a lot of animals they don't reproduce, like mules, for example. You have a donkey and a horse, and you have a mule. It doesn't reproduce itself, but it's a pretty viable creature. It keeps recurring. So reproduction by itself may not be sufficient. There's a lot of cultivars that will not reproduce themselves as well. So I'm not sure that is...
right, that's a good point.
This is the problem. Are we speaking
Of Lucretius?
Well, I'm just saying that could be a potential objection.
Yes.
Also, I'm thinking in this conjunction, Hesiod and his cosmogony, and how there you have also first generation of monsters, right? So you have those pre-Titan beings that are completely unviable. They're like they're given birth by Earth and the sky, and they come into existence. But then because they're monsters with so many heads and so many arms and so many, they have to be passed down to, they have to be cast away and then replaced by the order of the Titans.
No, I think the argument of Lucretius is that every form can persist if there is a concursus of a lot of conditions. Concurrere multa in rebus. So reproduction cannot be the only condition. But the problem is that the forms exist every form exists in a sort of connexio, textura, in a texture, in a context, in a texture of living beings. So you cannot have the reproduction of the form as something fixed. But the problem is there are the two possibilities of reading, the one of Canguilhem and the one of Bergson. I think you can read the text in the two ways. I think the most general lecture is the Canguilhem lecture, the Canguilhem way of reading. You imagine a sort of chaos, originary chaos, and then you have the pact of nature and the reproduction of the forms. But this is perhaps you can find passages on Lucretius' text that give reason to Canguilhem. But I think it's a way to reduce the power of Lucretius. That is, every form is thought in a texture. Every reproduction is the effect of the conjunction of multiple line of causality.
Filippo?
Yeah, thanks. It's going to be a quite long question. I apologize in advance. Your piece of scholarship is one of the most powerful things that I know on the topic, and yet I think there's more work to do. I share your unsatisfaction with both Canguilhem and Bergson, but still the Althusserian way leaves me unsatisfied either. I think that you take the argument of both Bergson and Canguilhem that the question is played between two elements, the ratio on one hand and the telos on the other. It is a two-element thing. And I think this is a wrong perspective because it pushes us to ask the wrong question to the text. Do the federa natura comes before or after the events? And if we ask this question, we're not going to have an answer. My sense is that we should rather think the problem through three elements and that must be kept distinguished. The ratio, the certa ratio, which is very different, and the telos, of course. If we accept this rough definition of the three of them, the ratio is what things are.
What things?
Things are what they are. The certa ratio is things are what they are, and they cannot be something else. And the telos, things are what they ought to be, what they should be. If we have these three elements rather than the two, maybe we ask a different question. I think that Lucretius here is balanced between two opposing needs. One fighting against the telos, and the other fighting against superstition. And which is going to be the same problem that Spinoza will have. And it's not it's not the same fight, but it requires the same tools, if you want. I wonder, and we discussed this before, whether, and this I'm very curious to know what the other thinks, so this is my question, rather than asking what comes before the federa or the telos, the real core of the problem is what the atoms are. And this was discussed between Jean Bollac and Jean Salem at some point. That's why I'm especially interested in what the French think about that. On the existence, the pre-existence of atoms to the encounter, or the fact that atoms comes out of the encounter and do not exist before the encounter. This is what Bollac suggests, and Salem responds that if we take that perspective, we lose the materialistic ground of atomism, and that's the danger that we see. And I don't know where to go. I really don't know. I'm a little bit lost there, but I feel that the Althusserian reading, with which you try to escape this unsatisfaction within Canguilhem and Bergson, is not satisfactory either. What do we do with that?
Prima della lezione. Okay. I don't know. I have the impression that everything that exists in the Lucretian world has a certa ratio. So monster and living beings and forms that reproduce themselves. And the problem is that every living being exists in a texture, in a context of relations. So, forcing Lucretius, you can say, in the sense of Darwin, this is, of course, Lucretius as forerunner of Darwin. But if you force Lucretius in this sense, you can say that the monsters are simply some variation that are not reproducible in the context. It's the context that renders a monster a monster. It is not exactly what Lucretius says, because Lucretius says that the problem is quite internal. But I think if we push to the extreme the idea of the combination, the infinite combination, you have some ratio of things, some certa ratio of things, and this combination renders some living beings reproducible and other not. About the question of and so this is the way in which you can eliminate come si dice eliminare eliminate the problem of telos. Is the only way, because if you say that there is a form, the pector nature produce are guarantee of the forms, of the reproduction of the forms, there you have the telos. Because what can reproduce a form if not a telos? È un'essenza. The problem is the certa ratio is an essence in the traditional sense, or is in a reading through Spinoza, is a proportion of movement and rest. So if you think an essence in the traditional sense, there you have a telos. If you say man is so and so, there you have a telos, because it's the Aristotelian form. You cannot eliminate telos without eliminating essence. This is why, for example, it was very interesting, the reading of Diderot, because it refuses a humanism of essence. About the question of the existence of the atoms, I imagine Jean Salem is Stalinist, so he wants the matter. He wants matter there. I think we don't need the matter in this way. We don't need some atoms that strikes. I think they are affirming in the two ways, relation or existence, pre-existence of atoms. The problem is necessity. There is a necessity in nature. It's the atoms and void is the same way in which Lucretius say what Spinoza says with Deus, as causa immanes. It's the same way, because the problem is there is a necessity, and this necessity is not a simple necessity, a linear necessity, but it's a plural necessity on different stages. Laurent has wrote in his book a part on this. Are different level of necessity that are intricated Non so se ti ho risposto, ma ne discutiamo con calma.
Andrea? No? Sue?
It was just a question of clarification about the way Officer uses the Klineman, and I was wondering, because I had understood his reading was that this word was originary rather than, is that, am I incorrect in understanding that?
No, Althusser, it must be said that I don't want to defend the thesis of Althusser. I try to use the text of Althusser to think the text of Lucretius, because the Althusser's reconstruction of Epicureanism is one page. You have some idea, and I think the idea of the primacy of the swerve over the logos, of the form, is very interesting. Then, so the problem is in the idea of the underground current of the materialism of the encounter. The problem is not to lose the necessity, because if you put too much the accent on the Klineman, on the swerve, then you have a sort of radical contingency of every being. And this is, and I think this is not the right way to use this text of Althusser. This is the way to go to Badiou and the event and something like some messianism or irrationalism. Questo è molto lucacciano, Bordeaux si sta lì. I think my problem is to think together chance and necessity. So when I use the concept of Klineman in the interpretation of Althusser, I use in the sense that the Klineman breaks the pacts of fate, against the Stoics, but then opens the necessity, and this necessity is a necessity that is innervated by the chance. So every reproduction of form is a necessary reproduction, but this necessary reproduction is produced by the concursus of a multiplicity of conditions. Ok, non ce la faccio più.
Grazie.